For most of modern history, humanity has told itself a comforting story, that we are the first to reach this level of complexity, the first to build global systems, the first to stand at the edge of planetary consequence. But what if that story is wrong? Across every continent, buried beneath sand, jungle, ice, and ocean, lie the remains of civilizations that should not exist according to the official timeline. Cities too large, engineering too precise, knowledge too advanced for the age they are assigned. And the deeper we look, the more disturbing the pattern becomes. These civilizations did not disappear randomly. They vanished almost simultaneously, not over millions of years, but within narrow windows of time. Something happened. Not a myth, not a metaphor, a real, measurable disruption in the human story. This documentary is not about proving legends true. It is about confronting a possibility modern civilization finds uncomfortable. That we are not the first to build a world, and we may not be the last to lose one. Because if civilizations before us rose, mastered their environment, and still collapsed, then progress alone does not guarantee survival. And that realization changes everything. Transition. To understand what was lost, we must first understand how much existed long before history claims civilization began. According to mainstream history, complex civilization began roughly 6,000 years ago. Before that, humans were supposedly scattered, primitive, and technologically limited. Yet this narrative collapses the moment physical evidence enters the conversation. Massive stone complexes aligned with celestial events. Megaliths weighing hundreds of tons moved with precision still unexplained today. Mathematical knowledge embedded in architecture that mirrors planetary cycles. These are not the products of chance. They are signatures of planning, standardization, and accumulated knowledge. Even more unsettling, many of these sites appear older than their surrounding cultures, as if later civilizations inherited ruins they did not build, and repurposed knowledge they no longer fully understood. This suggests something rarely discussed, that human civilization may not be linear, it may be cyclical. Rise, peak, collapse, forgetting, then rise again, believing itself to be the first. The timeline is not broken, it is incomplete, and the gaps are not accidents. They exist because collapse erases context faster than memory can preserve it. But if advanced civilizations existed before us, the question becomes unavoidable. What destroyed them?
Civilizations rarely collapse in a single moment. They unravel quietly. Systems grow complex. Dependence deepens. Warnings are ignored because they threaten stability. Evidence suggests ancient civilizations face challenges hauntingly familiar to us today: climate instability, resource depletion, environmental imbalance. But unlike modern society, they lacked global redundancy. When systems failed, there was no external support. And then, silence. No final records, no explanations carved clearly for future generations. Only fragments, symbols, alignments, and the unsettling realization that some of these structures were not built merely to last. They were built to communicate across catastrophe. Messages not for their contemporaries, but for survivors. For us. If these civilizations tried to leave warnings, then the next question is terrifyingly simple. What were they trying to warn us about? If the lost civilizations wanted to warn the future, they could not rely on words. Languages die quickly, scripts erode, symbols are reinterpreted. So they chose a medium that transcends culture. Stone, geometry, the sky. Across the ancient world, structures appear that are not merely architectural, but astronomical. Temples aligned with solstices, pyramids calibrated to cardinal directions with astonishing precision, monuments positioned to mirror the movement of stars thousands of years into the future.
This was not decoration, it was encoding. By embedding knowledge into the movement of celestial bodies, these civilizations ensured that their message would remain readable as long as the sky itself endured. Astronomy became a universal language, one that no conqueror could erase. The builders understood something fundamental, that civilizations may fall, but cycles repeat. And by anchoring their warnings to predictable cosmic rhythms, they created a message immune to political collapse. Stone becomes memory. The sky becomes archive. What they left behind was not a story, but a system, a way for future observers to recognize that what happened once could happen again. But astronomical knowledge alone does not explain the scale of what these civilizations achieved. To understand that, we must examine the infrastructure beneath the symbols. Beneath the visible monuments lies something even more revealing: infrastructure. Road networks spanning entire regions, water management systems that regulated floods and droughts, urban layouts designed for population densities far higher than officially acknowledged. These were not isolated cities, they were integrated systems. Evidence suggests coordination across vast distances, shared standards of measurement, construction techniques, and symbolic language. This implies not just communication, but administration, a world that functioned at scale. What challenges modern assumptions is not merely that these systems existed, but that they worked for centuries, sometimes millennia. And yet, they are absent from mainstream narratives, because acknowledging them forces an uncomfortable realization that technological sophistication does not guarantee permanence. In fact, the more advanced a system becomes, the more catastrophic its failure can be. The infrastructure that once supported abundance becomes the mechanism of collapse when it can no longer adapt. And when collapse begins, it does not announce itself as disaster. It arrives as inconvenience, then instability, then normalization. This brings us to a critical insight, one that connects ancient collapse directly to our present moment. Every civilization that collapses believes itself to be different, more advanced, more prepared, more rational. This belief is not arrogance, it is a survival mechanism. It allows societies to function without constant fear of failure. But it also creates a blind spot. The lost civilizations appear to have reached a point where progress outpaced wisdom, where expansion continued even as foundational systems weakened. They trusted continuity. They believed that tomorrow would resemble yesterday because it always had, until it didn't. Collapse, in this light, is not sudden destruction, it is delayed recognition. Warnings were likely present: environmental signals, resource stress, social fragmentation. But acknowledging them would have required slowing growth, and growth had become synonymous with success. So the signals were reinterpreted, minimized, ignored. And when adaptation finally became unavoidable, it was already too late. This pattern is not ancient, it is familiar, which raises the most unsettling possibility of all, that the true warning left by these civilizations was not about a specific catastrophe, but about human behavior itself. If that is true, then the next question is unavoidable. Are we repeating the same pattern on a global scale? The Earth remembers what civilizations forget. Long before written history, the planet recorded its own archive, embedded in ice cores, sediment layers, fossilized shorelines, and buried forests. These records tell a story not of stability, but of cycles. Periods of abundance followed by disruption, warmth followed by sudden cooling, expansion followed by contraction. The lost civilizations did not fear these cycles, they studied them. Their architecture reflects this awareness. Cities positioned away from floodplains, sacred sites placed at elevations marking ancient sea levels, monuments aligned to solar and lunar extremes that coincided with climatic shifts. These were not religious coincidences, they were environmental markers. The builders understood that Earth operates on rhythms far longer than a human lifetime, but devastatingly short for civilizations that refuse to adapt. What modern science now confirms, ancient civilizations observed directly, that planetary systems can change faster than societies can respond. And when response lags behind reality, collapse becomes inevitable. But climate alone does not erase civilizations. To disappear completely, something more must break.
Environmental stress does not destroy civilizations directly. It exposes weaknesses. As resources become unpredictable, social cohesion fractures. Systems built on stability struggle to function under uncertainty. Inequality deepens. Trust erodes. Evidence from lost civilizations suggests that collapse began internally, long before external catastrophe struck. Urban centers grew denser, while rural systems failed. Political power centralized as local resilience weakened. Decision-making slowed precisely when speed mattered most. And perhaps most dangerous of all, societies began to argue about reality itself. When consensus collapses, coordination becomes impossible. The archaeological record hints at this breakdown. Abandoned administrative centers, incomplete construction projects, defensive structures built hastily, then left unused. These are signs not of invasion, but of internal disintegration. The civilization did not fall because it lacked intelligence. It fell because intelligence became fragmented.
At some point, the lost civilizations understood a painful truth. They would not survive, but humanity might. This realization changed everything. Instead of building monuments to power, they began constructing repositories of knowledge, structures designed not for dominance, but for endurance. Sites placed in locations least likely to be destroyed by floods, ice, or fire. Information was compressed into symbols. Knowledge was abstracted into geometry. Warnings were embedded into myth. They stopped building for themselves and started building for survivors, for whoever would come next. This is why so many ancient sites appear unfinished, because the goal was no longer perfection, it was transmission. They were no longer architects of empire. They became stewards of memory. And that may be their greatest achievement. If these sites were meant for survivors, then the most important question remains unanswered. Were we meant to find them now? For centuries, the warnings slept beneath the surface of the earth, buried by sediment, hidden by vegetation, dismissed as myth. Then, slowly, they began to re-emerge. Satellite imagery revealed patterns invisible from the ground, geometry spanning kilometers, impossible to design without aerial perspective. Ground-penetrating radar uncovered entire urban layouts beneath modern cities. Ocean mapping exposed structures resting far below sea levels, where no civilization was supposed to exist. These discoveries did not arrive all at once. They appeared gradually, scattered across disciplines, languages, and borders. And because of that, they were easy to ignore. But taken together, they form a signal that suggests the past is not as distant as we believed, and that the knowledge left behind was waiting for a civilization capable of recognizing it. Modern technology did not create these discoveries, it merely revealed them. The warning was always there.
Accepting the existence of lost advanced civilizations comes at a cost. It challenges timelines, it disrupts authority, it destabilizes comfortable narratives. Because if civilizations before us achieved complexity and still collapsed, then modern society is not exceptional, it is vulnerable. This realization threatens more than academic consensus, it threatens identity. So resistance formed. Evidence was compartmentalized, discoveries were isolated, questions were reframed as fringe speculation rather than systemic inquiry, not through conspiracy, but through inertia. Institutions are designed to preserve continuity, and continuity depends on predictability. The lost civilizations do not fit neatly into predictable history. Acknowledging them forces us to confront the possibility that collapse is not failure, but recurrence, and that is a truth many are unwilling to face.
When ancient symbols are compared across continents, a remarkable convergence appears. Different cultures, different languages, the same themes: floods, fire, sky changes, cycles of renewal and destruction. These were not isolated myths, they were fragmented memories of shared experience, encoded not as dates, but as stories capable of surviving collapse. The lost civilizations understood that factual records perish, but narratives endure. So they transformed catastrophe into myth, not to obscure truth, but to preserve it. And now, with modern tools, we are beginning to decode what they left behind, not as prophecy, not as superstition, but as precedent. The warning is no longer subtle. It is repeated, global, consistent. And it leads to a question we can no longer postpone. If they saw it coming, and we are seeing the same signals now, what happens if we choose to ignore them again? To answer that, we must confront the present through the lens of the past.
When the past is viewed in isolation, it feels distant, abstract, safe. But when the past is compared directly to the present, distance collapses. The patterns become unmistakable. Ancient civilizations expanded rapidly during periods of environmental stability. Surplus led to population growth. Growth demanded infrastructure. Infrastructure required resources. Resources became strained. And when limits were reached, warning signs appeared. Soil degradation, water scarcity, climate irregularities, social polarization. These signals were not interpreted as systemic failure, but as temporary disruption. Leaders reassured populations. Institutions protected existing structures. The momentum of civilization carried forward, even as foundations weakened. Modern society follows the same trajectory, with greater speed, greater scale, and far higher stakes. We measure progress through growth. We equate stability with permanence. We treat warnings as inconveniences. The lost civilizations are not cautionary tales because they were ignorant, but because they were confident. And confidence delays adaptation. This is the mirror they left behind. If the present reflects the past so clearly, then the next question is unavoidable. Where are we on the timeline of collapse? Civilizations do not collapse at the moment of crisis. They collapse at the moment they lose the ability to change. The archaeological record suggests that ancient civilizations reached a threshold, a point where adaptation required transformation rather than adjustment. Incremental solutions were no longer enough. Resource systems demanded redesign. Social structures required redistribution. Values needed realignment. But transformation threatens power, and power resists transformation. So civilizations delay. They apply short-term solutions to long-term problems. They optimize failing systems instead of replacing them. They confuse efficiency with resilience. The threshold is not marked by catastrophe, but by hesitation. And once crossed, recovery becomes exponentially more difficult. Modern civilization now approaches this same threshold, globalized, interconnected, and dependent on systems that cannot fail without cascading consequences. This is not a prediction, it is a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, present a choice. One of the most dangerous beliefs shared by advanced civilizations is the illusion of control. Control over nature, control over systems, control over outcomes. The lost civilizations believed they had mastered their environment until the environment changed faster than their systems could respond. Control works only within stable conditions. When conditions shift, control becomes fragility. Modern civilization possesses unprecedented technological power, but power does not equal adaptability. In fact, high control often reduces flexibility. We engineer certainty into a world defined by uncertainty. The ancients learned, too late, that survival does not come from forcing stability, but from aligning with change. This realization marks the turning point of this documentary. Because from this point forward, the question is no longer what happened to them.
It becomes what happens to us. To answer that, we must listen carefully to what the past has been trying to say all along.
There is a moment in every collapsing civilization when denial ends. Not publicly, not officially, but internally. The archaeological record suggests that the lost civilizations reached this moment not through catastrophe, but through accumulation, a convergence of failures too consistent to dismiss. Crop cycles no longer aligned. Floods arrived earlier or later than expected. Seasonal patterns broke their promises. At first, these anomalies were treated as exceptions. Priests recalibrated calendars. Engineers reinforced infrastructure. Leaders reassured their populations. But eventually, recalibration failed. When prediction stops working, belief begins to fracture. This is when awareness emerges, not as panic, but as clarity. The realization that systems once trusted can no longer guarantee continuity, that the future will not resemble the past. For the lost civilizations, this realization did not produce chaos, it produced urgency. They understood that they could not stop the cycle, but they could respond to it, and that response would redefine their final chapter. What followed was not retreat, but a radical shift in purpose.
Once the inevitability of collapse became undeniable, priorities changed. Expansion stopped. Conquest ended. Monuments to power ceased. Instead, effort shifted toward preservation, not of territory, but of meaning. The civilization began consolidating knowledge, simplifying systems, reducing dependence on fragile networks. Resources were redirected away from growth and toward endurance. This is why many late-stage ancient structures appear austere compared to earlier monumental works. They are quieter, more deliberate, less ornamental, because their purpose was no longer display, it was transmission. Knowledge was distilled to its essence. What mattered for survival? What could be remembered without institutions? What could be reconstructed without authority? They prepared not for victory, but for continuity. This decision marks a moral transformation rarely acknowledged in history, the choice to become ancestors rather than rulers. And in doing so, they left behind something far more powerful than empire.
It is tempting to assume that the final message of a dying civilization would be one of fear. But fear does not endure. The evidence suggests something far more deliberate. The lost civilizations did not encode panic. They encoded perspective. Their final message was not, "This will happen." It was, "This has happened before." They wanted future civilizations to understand that collapse is not punishment, it is consequence, the natural result of imbalance, overreach, and forgetting limits. By removing moral judgment from catastrophe, they offered something rare, the possibility of learning without shame. This is why their warnings are subtle rather than explicit, why they require interpretation rather than obedience, why they invite reflection rather than submission. They trusted future intelligence, and now that trust rests with us.
For most of modern history, lost civilizations were treated as curiosities, mysteries to admire, ruins to photograph, stories to romanticize. But at a certain point, curiosity turns into recognition, because the patterns preserved in stone, soil, and silence are no longer abstract. They are unfolding again, this time at a planetary scale. The same signals appear, accelerating environmental instability, widening social fractures, systems optimized for growth rather than resilience. Once again, complexity increases faster than adaptability. The past is no longer whispering, it is speaking directly. What makes this moment unprecedented is not the danger, but the awareness. For the first time in history, a civilization can recognize the trajectory of collapse before reaching its endpoint. This awareness is both a gift and a burden, because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And recognition forces a question that civilizations rarely ask in time.
Every civilization is ultimately tested, not by strength, but by restraint. The final test is not whether a society can expand, but whether it can stop expanding when expansion becomes self-destructive. The lost civilizations failed this test not because they were incapable, but because stopping felt like surrender. Growth had become identity. Power had become purpose. Modern civilization now faces the same test, only faster, larger, and irreversible at a global scale. This is not a test of technology. It is a test of values. Can a civilization redefine success away from domination and accumulation? Can it prioritize long-term continuity over short-term advantage? Can it choose transformation without catastrophe? These questions are not philosophical. They are structural. And the answer will determine whether future archaeologists study our ruins or our transition. Because survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone.
Lost civilizations teach us something crucial. Collapse is not an ending. It is a transformation, either conscious or forced. The story always changes at the moment choice becomes unavoidable, when denial collapses, when narratives fracture, when the future can no longer be postponed. This is that moment, not in a single event, but in a sequence of decisions already underway, decisions that will define whether this civilization becomes another chapter in the archaeological record, or something fundamentally new. For the first time, humanity stands at the edge of a transition, with memory as a guide. The past has done its part. It left us evidence, patterns, warnings without commands. What remains is the most difficult task of all, to listen. And listening leads us to the final message hidden beneath the ruins.
After collapse, there is always silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of excess fading away. The noise of ambition, expansion, and control dissolves, leaving only what remains when systems fail. The lost civilizations did not vanish overnight. They thinned, they simplified, they retreated from complexity that could no longer be sustained. Cities emptied slowly, trade routes shortened, institutions dissolved into memory. And in that quiet, something unexpected emerged: clarity. Without the pressure to grow, to conquer, to compete, people reconnected with scale, with limits, with place. Collapse stripped civilization down to its essentials and revealed what was never essential at all. This is why ruins feel peaceful. They are the aftermath of release. But silence is not the end of the message. Empires fall, but not everything collapses with them. What survives is rarely what was most powerful, but what was most adaptable. Languages evolved, knowledge fragmented but persisted. Cultural memory flowed through stories rather than institutions. The lost civilizations understood this near the end, that endurance does not require dominance, that continuity depends on flexibility. This is why the most enduring elements of ancient societies are not their empires, but their ideas, their calendars, their agricultural knowledge, their ethical frameworks. Power disappears when systems fail. Meaning does not. This realization reframes collapse, not as annihilation, but as compression, a reduction that preserves essence. And essence, once preserved, becomes seed. Seeds, however, require time and intention to grow. The final gift of the lost civilizations was not a warning of destruction. It was an invitation to see collapse not as failure, but as feedback, a response from reality when systems exceed their limits. They did not expect future civilizations to avoid collapse entirely. They expected cycles. What they hoped was that future societies would recognize them early and soften the landing. This is the deepest truth hidden beneath the ruins, that survival is not about preventing change, but guiding it. We are not being asked to save civilization as it exists. We are being asked to decide what deserves to survive. And that decision begins now, because every civilization writes its final chapter long before it realizes the story is ending.
Once a warning is understood, it transforms into responsibility. The lost civilizations did not leave us instructions, they left us perspective, and perspective, once internalized, demands response. Knowledge changes nothing unless it alters behavior. This is where many civilizations fail, not because they lack intelligence, but because understanding does not always translate into action. Awareness without adaptation is merely anticipation of collapse. Modern civilization now stands at this threshold. We possess the data. We recognize the patterns. We understand the consequences. What remains uncertain is not the outcome, but the choice. Responsibility does not mean control, it means alignment, the willingness to redesign systems around limits rather than illusions. This is the hardest task any civilization can face, because it requires humility, and humility reshapes how we define progress itself.
For centuries, progress has been measured by expansion, more production, more consumption, more control. But the lost civilizations reveal the flaw in this equation. Growth without balance accelerates collapse. Progress divorced from sustainability becomes regression. True progress is not faster growth, but deeper stability. A civilization that lasts is one that understands restraint not as loss, but as intelligence, that measures success by resilience rather than dominance. This redefinition does not demand regression to the past. It requires evolution beyond outdated metrics. The ancients failed not because they built too much, but because they failed to stop building when building became destructive. Modern civilization has the opportunity they did not, to pause, to reflect, to change direction without ruin. And that opportunity carries profound consequences.
Every civilization leaves behind a message, whether intentional or not. Future generations will interpret our remains not by what we believed, but by what we preserved. They will ask, did this civilization listen when it understood? Did it adapt when adaptation was still possible? Did it choose continuity over comfort? The lost civilizations are not silent judges. They are witnesses. Their ruins do not accuse us. They wait. And in that waiting lies the final meaning of this documentary, that history is not behind us, it is watching. All that remains is the final question.
Every civilization inherits a moment that defines it, not a single event, but a convergence, a narrowing of possibilities where the future becomes shaped less by chance and more by choice. This is that moment. The lost civilizations faced it without the benefit of hindsight. They moved forward blind to the full consequences of their actions. We do not share that limitation. We carry memory. Memory is civilization's greatest advantage and its greatest burden, because memory removes innocence. It replaces uncertainty with responsibility. The ruins we study today are not distant warnings. They are mirrors held across time, and what they reflect is not destiny, but agency. This moment belongs to us now. Civilization is not a structure. It is a conversation carried across generations. Each society adds a sentence. Some add questions. Others add warnings. A few add wisdom. The lost civilizations did not end the conversation. They handed it forward. Their collapse did not erase their voice. It amplified it. Now we are speaking back. Every choice we make becomes part of that dialogue. Every system we preserve or redesign sends a message into the future. Civilizations are remembered not for their intentions, but for their outcomes, and outcomes are shaped by whether societies listen when history speaks. This documentary is not a conclusion. It is a continuation. At the end of every civilization's story, one question remains unanswered. Not what did they build, not how powerful were they, but this: did they understand the moment they were in? The lost civilizations left us enough evidence to answer that question for ourselves. They understood, too late. We are earlier in the story, which means the ending is not written.
What we choose to preserve? What we choose to change? What we choose to let go? These decisions will determine whether future generations study our ruins or inherit our resilience. The past has spoken. The future is listening.